The Iran Threat, What to Expect in 2023. Please welcome Dr. Peter Brooks, Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation Center for National Defense.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Clough Center and our event on Iran Threat in 2023. I don't know if you caught this in the news this morning, but almost on cue, there was news about the fact that the U.S. and Israel are having major military exercises, all-domain exercises. And I think that's probably an effort to signal to Iran that despite the fact that the United States has challenges in Asia with China and North Korea, as well as in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, that the United States feels it can step up and tend to issues in the Middle East as well. There's a lot of ground to cover this morning, or this afternoon in an hour or so. So there's a lot of issues on Iran and the threat and different variations. But we decided in this event to focus on three issues. The Iran nuclear program, Iran's support of terrorism and proxy groups, and for something a little novel, Iran's growing defense relationship with Russia. Joining us today to discuss these issues are Andrea Stricker and Jim Phillips. Andrea is an expert on nuclear weapons proliferation and illicit procurement networks. She has extensively researched Iran's nuclear program, including its history, proliferation efforts, and diplomatic agreements. Prior to joining FDD, where she is now, Andrea spent more than 12 years at the Institute for Science and International Security. The good ISIS, right? Isn't that right, Andrea? Poor people, they were ISIS before ISIS, right? So I think they had to change, what is their Twitter feed to @good ISIS. And she is the co-author of 5 books on nuclear proliferation. Sitting next to me is Jim Phillips. Jim is a visiting fellow at the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. He is a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Middle Eastern security issues and international terrorism since coming to the Heritage Foundation in 1979, about the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right?
The Iranian Revolution, too.
Right, there you go. He has authored dozens of papers on Iran, its nuclear program and use of terrorism, and has testified before Congress on Iran's nuclear challenge and other Middle East security issues. So with those brief introductions, I'll turn it over to Andrea for some thoughts on Iran's nuclear program.
Well, thank you all for being here, joining us, and to Heritage for hosting. It's great to be here with you, Peter and Jim. And thanks for allowing me to join you remotely. So what to expect on Iran, particularly on the nuclear program this year? I think a few things. First, a more dangerous situation as Iran nears the nuclear threshold, more temptation to break out of its non-proliferation obligations. Of course, more global and not just regional destabilization efforts by Tehran as it arms Russia against Ukraine with missiles and drones, and a truly awful situation in Iran as the regime executes its young people for protesting and demanding their basic human rights. But on the nuclear front, Iran's current status is that it has not been observing the terms of the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, since May 2019, and it withdrew altogether in 2020. After trying to negotiate the deal's revival since entering office in January 2021, the Biden administration appears to recognize that the accord is not viable any longer. President Biden in November was caught on camera talking about how the deal is dead, but he said that he won't announce that it's dead. He didn't say why, but we can speculate. It's likely because the administration is keeping the deal on the back burner in case the protests in Iran die down and the regime wants to conclude a deal. But the administration has yet to explain how it makes sense to provide billions of dollars in sanctions relief to the regime for an accord that is technically defunct and soon expiring. And we see what's happening with Iran's nuclear program now as a warning of what happens in a few years' time if the deal were in place. But it would be a worse situation then because the regime would also be flush with cash to pursue malign objectives. So the fact is, whether you agree with Trump withdrawing from the deal or not, the approach pursued by President Biden hasn't worked. Tehran's program has galloped ahead, while the administration has been trying to convince it to revive the deal. Under President Biden, Iran enriched uranium to the highest level ever, 60%, which is 99% of the technical effort required to make atomic weapons fuel. It made uranium metal, and that's a material used in a nuclear weapon core. and it's now operating more than 4,500 of its fast advanced centrifuges, thousands of which did not exist prior to 2015, and the R&D for those machines was permitted under the deal. It's also curtailed the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IEA's, monitoring. And I work with the good ISIS still to analyze quarterly IEA reporting on Iran. The latest data from November tells us that Tehran has enough enriched uranium to make weapons-grade uranium for 6 nuclear weapons in 3 months. We estimate a short timeline of less than 6 months for Tehran to be able to explode a crude nuclear device in a demonstration test, which for all intents and purposes is all you need to show that you've established nuclear deterrence, even if mounting a weapon on a missile would take longer. The IEA has also not been able to have eyes on Iran's advanced centrifuge production since February 2021, and the regime could stockpile just a few hundred of its fastest model, the IR-6 centrifuge, for example, and use it at a secret site to break out of its non-proliferation obligations. Thanks to the information seized from Tehran by the Israeli Mossad in 2018, we also know that Iran dispersed its nuclear weaponization activities in 2003 and put them at both civilian and military research sites. Their status is not known, but we do know that they planned to centrally coordinate the activities, even if they dispersed them. Much can be done on the nuclear weaponization front via computer simulations. As of 2003, the regime still had several bottlenecks in their weaponization program, but they may have progressed in those intervening years. All that kind of work would be carried out at the most sensitive facilities by only a few people, and it would be a difficult target for intelligence agencies, to say the least. Moreover, any effort by Israel or the United States to try to bomb Iran's program or intervene in a breakout would need to be sustained over some time, and there's no guarantee that it would succeed. So in short, the motives and the temptation for Iran to cross the nuclear threshold are growing. It's diversifying its pathways to breakout, hardening its nuclear assets underground, and making the program a more difficult target. So what do? Well, the Biden administration should be shifting gears in a major way, away from diplomacy in the JCPOA, and announcing what both Heritage and FDD call a Plan B, a comprehensive strategy to fundamentally roll back and coercively deter and destabilize the regime at a time when it is at its weakest at home. This would require reviving our oil sanctions and our secondary sanctions against trade in coordination with Europe, replacing the UN sanctions, snapping them back, and restoring the arms embargo that lifted in 2020 and prevent the missile embargo from expiring in October, holding Iran to account at the IAEA, where the agency is investigating safeguards breaches, and also taking careful action inside Iran to assist protesters to succeed in their aim of establishing representative governance. I'm sure we'll get to all of this more, but I think it's safe to say that the Biden administration is not shifting to a comprehensive strategy. They're pursuing something like a holding pattern or a pressure light strategy, because they've always thought that maximum pressure doesn't work. The problem is this gives Iran a lot more time and space to contemplate dashing for atomic weapons, and with a supreme leader aging, he may believe that now is the time to secure his legacy and his regime for the future.
Thank you. I was going to say in a moment of shameless self-promotion, this is our paper on Plan B, and Andrea, if you'd like to mention yours, I'd be happy to have the audience be aware of where they can find your paper and the name of it. Ours is called the Biden Administration Plan Won't Work, Time for Plan B. This was put out by Jim and I in December. This is available, obviously online. You have your paper available right there, by any chance, Andrea?
Yeah, it's actually on the main page of FDD. It's a comprehensive Iran strategy, and it has recommendations for each agency of the U.S. government and steps they should take to counter the threat.
Thank you. Jim, what about Iran's support to terror and proxy groups?
Okay. I think it's safe to say that in the coming year, Iran's Islamist dictatorship will continue to pose multiple threats to the U.S. and its allies, and at the forefront of these threats is likely to be terrorism, either directly applied by Iran or indirectly applied through Tehran's many proxy groups. And I say this not just because Iran has a long history of supporting terrorism since its 1979 revolution, and which stood up a totalitarian Islamist regime that routinely used terrorism to seize power and maintain itself in power. But also, I argue that Iran's terrorist threat is increasing because the capabilities of Iran's proxy groups have increased greatly in the last few years, and the regime itself faces an existential crisis. And I believe that it fears that this massive popular rebellions that has swept Iran could become a successful revolution. And this threat to the regime's survival, I believe, will give it increased motivation to foment a crisis with Iran's foreign adversaries, not only to distract attention from the regime's crimes against its own people, but also perhaps, I think the regime hopes it could rally Iranians around the flag against foreign enemies. And since the death of Masa Amini in September, ostensibly because of bad hijab at the hands of the morality police, the regime has been stunned by over 2,000 anti-government protests that have occurred all across Iran and that have called for the overthrow of the regime and death to the dictator. In response, the regime has dug in its heels. It's doubled down on repression and rejected demands for meaningful reform. The internal security forces have killed more than 500 people. The state has executed 4 protesters that allegedly killed security forces, has strung up their bodies on cranes and left them hanging in order to intimidate protesters and deter future protests. More than 100 protesters now are at risk of being executed. And these recent executions have reduced pressure on the regime. The protests have slowed, although they continue. The pace outside of the Sunni areas has slowed, but in areas predominantly inhabited by Sunni Iranians, those protests have been very intense, particularly in Kurdish, Baluch, and Arab areas, where those groups are doubly discriminated against, not only as ethnic minorities, but as a religious Sunni minority, persecuted, I would argue, by a Shia Persian state. Protesters have altered their strategy. They play a more of a cat and mouse game. They encourage smaller and more localized protests that are less risky for the participants. Though they're leaderless, decentralized, and dispersed, and these are all factors that give the protesters better chance of avoiding arrests, jailing, torture, and execution. But unfortunately, these are also factors that make it unlikely that the regime will be overthrown, at least in the coming year. Yet, the protests have been remarkably persistent, with security services so far unable to end these protests as they have done in previous rounds. The regime, incapable of reforming itself, has fallen back on its strong suit, that's state terrorism, to intimidate the domestic opposition. This may work in the short run, but I doubt it will work in the long run against an upcoming generation that is fed up with the corruption, the repression, and the social controls imposed by this dictatorship. The persistent waves of protests have eroded away what little legitimacy remains to the regime. So although the regime is unlikely to implode, it now faces, I think, the greatest threat to its survival since it gained power in 1979. And this is why I say there's a growing danger that Iran will trigger a crisis to distract its people. The regime has already set the stage for such a strategy by denouncing protesters as treasonous mercenaries of Iran's foreign enemies, specifically the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia. Indeed, Iran is already engaged in a shadow war against these countries using an extensive network of proxies and terrorist groups to orchestrate attacks against all three of these countries. The Revolutionary Guards have cultivated or created a broad spectrum of more than 30 proxy and terrorist groups to do their bidding. And some of these groups continue to attack US troops in Syria. Just last Friday, there was another drone attack on a small US base in eastern Syria that wounded 2 Syrian fighters aligned with the US. Sooner or later, I think an American is likely to be killed in one of these attacks, and then I think the Biden administration will be compelled finally to take some kind of action. Iran continues to support attacks against Israel from proxies in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, and attacks against Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates from proxies in Iraq and Yemen. Iran has launched artillery and drone attacks against Iranian Kurdish groups that have taken refuge in the Kurdish areas of northern Iraq, and Iran may well be tempted to intervene on the ground there, as Turkey has in the western part of Iraqi Kurdistan. Such an aggressive policy would be entirely consistent with Iran's history. Since the 1979 revolution, these Islamist revolutionaries have used terrorism to seize power, to maintain power against domestic adversaries, and to undermine the power of foreign adversaries. Indeed, it was an act of terrorism, taking hostage US diplomats in Tehran in 1979 that allowed the Islamists to outflank left-wing and secular revolutionaries and overthrow the Barzaghan provisional government. Iran's strenuous attempts to export its revolution failed in part because only about 15% of the Muslim world is Shia. Most are Orthodox or Sunni. And that naturally limited the appeal of Iran's radical Shia brand of Islamism. But unlike its failed efforts to export revolution, Iran's efforts to export terrorism have paid off in a big way, particularly in Lebanon, where Shia Lebanese form the largest single group of 17 ethnic and sectarian groups. Iran created, financed, and armed and trained Hezbollah, the Party of God, which it uses as a surrogate to attack its enemies, including the US and France, which had tilted against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War and were involved in Lebanon in the 1980s in the multinational peacekeeping force. Hezbollah, at the direction of Iran, attacked the U.S. Marine barracks and killed 241 U.S. servicemen. In October 1983, that same day, they truck bombed a French paratroop headquarters and killed 58 French soldiers. Hezbollah also was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the embassy annex. They took 15 American hostages, which advanced Iran's interests by leading the Reagan administration to enter the Iran concert crisis, in which arms were traded for hostages. I think before 9/11, Hezbollah had more American blood on its hands than any other terrorist group And today, Hezbollah has metastasized far beyond Lebanon, first to regional targets in the Middle East, and now it's a truly global terrorist threat backed by Iran that draws financial and logistical support from the Lebanese Shia diaspora in the Middle East, in Europe, North America, South America, and Africa. Hezbollah has a long record of terrorism against the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab states that are opposed to Iran. And Iran may activate Hezbollah to do its dirty work, as it did in Lebanon in the 1980s and in Syria in the past decade. Or Iran could use other proxy groups, such as the estimated 120,000 fighters that belong to radical Shia militias in Iraq that have pledged allegiance to Iran's supreme leader. This is a major threat. The Pentagon estimates that these groups killed more than 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, have deployed thousands of these Iraqi fighters to prop up the Assad regime in Syria, along with Hezbollah militias recruited from Afghan and Pakistani Shia. Iran also is training to equip the Houthi rebels Ansarallah, which every day looks more and more like Hezbollah in Yemen. And they overthrew the Yemeni government and are fighting a Saudi-led coalition in Yemen's brutal civil war. Iran also supports Palestinian terrorist groups such as Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It smuggled increasingly sophisticated rockets, missiles, and drones to these groups, and Hezbollah to be used against Israel. And Hezbollah alone has an estimated 130,000 rockets and missiles that it could potentially aim at Israel, and that's more than all of the European members of NATO combined. So this is no small threat. In addition to the military threat to U.S. Forces and allies in the Middle East, the FBI has warned that Hezbollah support cells inside the United States, which have operated for decades, could also be used in terrorist attacks, and the same is true in Europe. Both Iran and Hezbollah remain committed to avenging the death of General Qasem Soleimani, who was the leader of the Quds Force, the Jerusalem Force, the special forces arm of the Revolutionary Guards that are charged with exporting Iran's revolution and exporting terrorism. Soleimani was killed in a January 2020 drone strike in Iraq. And this past August, Iran was caught red-handed trying to take vengeance for that attack by assassinating former National Security Advisor John Bolton. An Iran-based member of the Revolutionary Guards was charged with attempting to arrange Bolton's murder in Washington, D.C. Iran has also been linked to assassination threats against former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, and former State Department Iran Coordinator Brian Hook. Yet the Biden administration remains remarkably complacent about this threat and other threats posed by Iran. And I would also point to the very curious attack, or to me, not so curious attack on the author Salman Rushdie last year. And the mainstream media reports that the motives of Rushdie's attacker, Hadi Matar, a U.S. citizen of Lebanese descent, were unknown. This came despite the decades-long Iranian campaign to murder Rushdie and Matar's own admission and clear evidence that he's a follower of the supreme leader and an ardent supporter of Hezbollah. Matar's profile in Facebook includes a photograph of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of Iran's Islamist revolution, who issued the so-called fatwa, or religious edict, against Rushdie in 1989. Matar's fake New Jersey driver's license combined the names of two famous Hezbollah leaders, which is another indication of his motivation. If Anyone needs to find it. And according to his mother, was reportedly radicalized after a 2018 visit to Lebanon to the family's ancestral village in Yarun, which is a prominent Hezbollah stronghold. And regardless of whether evidence surfaces of a direct connection between Hadi Matar and Iran's regime, I think it's likely at least there's a connection to Hezbollah. But the crux of the matter is that Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa against Rushdie is emblematic of the threat posed by Iran's theocratic regime to the US and to the world. This fatwa was a call to commit a religious sanctioned murder. It represents not just a threat to one man, but a threat to freedom of thought, the rule of law, and the international system as a whole. And it's an integral part of Iran's efforts to export its revolution, and these efforts are enshrined in Iran's constitution. So the bottom line is that Iran's radical Islamist regime has developed over decades a potent killing machine run by the Revolutionary Guards for eliminating the regime's opponents at home and abroad. And I think in the coming year, we're going to see more terrorism emanating from Tehran as the slow motion nuclear crisis heats up. And let me pass to Peter there.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Let me say a few words about the blossoming Russia-Iran security relationship. While it's relatively secretive, it seems to be quite serious from what we can see on the outside in the open space. Indeed, in December, CIA Director Burns said that the two of them they're seeing the beginnings of a full-fledged defense partnership. Considering the international policies of these two countries and their less than friendly views of the United States, that's very troubling. Unfortunately, Moscow and Tehran have some commonalities and common interests and have reasons to cooperate with one another. I don't think they're natural allies, quite frankly, but they seem to be willing to use each other for their own objectives. Of course, they're anti-West and they're anti-American. Both are largely politically and economically isolated due to their economic and international policies. They both have economic problems at home with their economies. Both are under sanctions, and they need partners to help them evade those sanctions. They both have concerns about Sunni extremism, but I am going to ask Jim about Iran's relationship with al-Qaeda. They're both major energy producers, as we know, and they have interests in energy markets. Russia has sold Iran weapons for many, many years, including advanced weapons, aircraft, S-300 air defense system. And if you remember, thinking back quite a number of years now, maybe I'm getting close to 30 years, that Russia began building Iran's first nuclear reactor, Bushehr, which is now online. Of course, they have a common relationship and common interest in what happens in Syria, as we've seen over the last several years. But of course, the war in Ukraine has pushed them closer. As you know, Iran is providing combat drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. I don't know the number of drones. Those numbers are out there, but I'm sure it's in the hundreds. Some of these are strike recce drones or drones for ISR, for intelligence collection. Others are loitering munitions, but they're having an effect on the conflict there. The Iranians are also providing training to the Russians on these drones, and there's been talk of a joint production line of drones at some point in the future. These drones, of course, are increasing the capabilities and lethality of Russian forces and the bloodshed in Ukraine. Arguably, these drones could be a factor in prolonging a nearly year-long war. Think about it, I guess next month will be a one-year anniversary of the beginning of that war, late February. Iran is clearly willing to attempt to expand its influence beyond the Middle East with its involvement with Russia. You may have also seen that Iran has a couple of ships on a world cruise right now. I think they're in Argentina. I don't think they really have that capability for power projection, but it is interesting, and it is an interesting signal to the rest of us. And then, of course, there are reports that, and I'm not aware that any of these have been transferred yet, of Iran transferring short-range ballistic missiles to Russia as well, such as the Fatah and Zulfikar missiles. But in my mind, the thing I've been thinking about a little bit is, what is Iran going to get in return for their support to Russia? We know what Russia's getting. While details are scant in the public space, Iran will likely get some sort of hard currency revenue for its provision of arms to Russia. This will certainly allow for more Iranian military adventurism. It'll help fund its nuclear and missile programs that Andrea talked about. It'll support its proxies in places like Yemen and Iraq and terrorist allies like Hezbollah. Likely to get support and has gotten support from Russia in international institutions. That would include the UN, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and maybe in future negotiations that might involve the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but we don't know what the future of that is. As you remember, Russia is party to that agreement along with China. I think Iran will also benefit significantly from the operational feedback it gets from the performance of its weapons in Ukraine. How they perform, if they have problems with this, how they're doing against countermeasures, and that will help Iran improve those weapons over time. Like others, such as China, we'll also learn about the use of missiles in modern warfare from Russia. Russia may be willing to, at some point, share their lessons learned from this conflict in Ukraine, and that would certainly, since Iran depends so much on their missile arsenal, which is the biggest in the Middle East, which I think they're saying is about 3,000 ballistic missiles. I don't know how many cruise missiles they've had. I've never seen what I consider to be a reliable number on the number of cruise missiles, but they have 3,000 ballistic missiles, and that's really part of their power projection. They will be watching this very closely, since they are currently, through their proxies, using these missiles. Iran is also very interested in getting Russian weapons and defense technologies. I think some of the possible weapons that have been talked about are Su-35s, the flanker aircraft, and air superiority aircraft, a fourth generation, a 4++ generation aircraft. There are rumors that the Iranians have actually been training in Russia on the Su-35, and that 2 squadrons, or about 24 aircraft, will arrive this spring, including maybe as early as March. It's not clear to me who will get those aircraft, whether it be the Iranian Air Force or it'll be the IRGC, but my sense is it'll probably go to the Iranian Air Force, since they run and maintain most of the other advanced Russian aircraft, including those that were left Iraq during the war. I think Iran is also interested in the S-400 air defense system, which is a very highly capable Russian air defense system. They already have the S-300, and if this would certainly improve their capability against any air attacks. There's talk of warships and submarines, and of course, the Russians transferred back, I guess, in the 1990s, some Kilo-class diesel submarines to the Iranians. But it's possible that the Iranians may be interested in Russian warships and submarines as well. Of course, there's so many other technologies, too. Of course, you have to wonder at this point, we talk about these systems, whether Russia really is willing to transfer or sell these systems while they're at war in Ukraine. The 24 Su-35 aircraft, I understand, are from a failed sale to Egypt. So they're available. They're probably export models, so they're probably not the ones that the Russian Air Force would use, although they certainly could. But you have to wonder what Russia is willing to transfer, considering they're fighting right now in Ukraine. Another interesting thing, I think, in the relationship as well, is that there are reports that the Russians have transferred captured Western weapon systems and technology to Iran for its exploitation. The Iranians are well known for their ability to reverse engineer complex weapon systems. Another area they might see help from Russia is in cyber capabilities. As we know, Iran is already very, very capable, but Russia, I think, is probably more capable. And there's a possibility that the Iranians may want some sort of help from the Russians in improving their offensive capabilities or their defensive capabilities on computer network operations, or perhaps they even might work together. What about missiles? This is something we certainly have to think about. Iran is obviously very capable. They've improved the accuracy and lethality of their ballistic missiles so far. But what about long-range missiles, including intercontinental ballistic missiles? I mean, the Iranians, for many, many years, have been developing, I believe, long-range missile systems under the cover of their space program. I mean, it's a well-known fact that if the technology of a space launch vehicle and an ICBM are very, very similar. That if you can put a good-sized satellite into space, you can also put a warhead anywhere on the Earth's planet. So the Iranians have been relying actually on the Russians to put up some of their satellites, but the Iranians have been working on developing this capability themselves, and they're saying that this is basically a peaceful space program. So would the Russians know ICBMs? Certainly. Would they be willing to help the Iranians in this area? And of course, last but not least, a major concern is would the Russians give any assistance to the Iranian nuclear program? Obviously, the Russians, as the country with the same large nuclear arsenal and many, many years of experience with nuclear weapons, could certainly help the Iranians. And I think we've seen over the years in proliferation circles that outside assistance can be key to changing the pace and rapidity of the development of a nuclear program. And obviously, Russians have the scientific and technical capabilities to help the Iranians in this area. Of course, Russia's going to have to think long and hard about any of these transfers, especially on some of these other things such as missiles and nuclear weapons. But it's something that we have to guard against, especially considering the state of Western-Russian relations right now. And there are implications to this defense relationship besides the specifics that I mentioned. In general, I think this means more problems for American and Western foreign policy. It could advance Iran's agenda to dominate the region and threaten U.S. allies, friends, and partners. It could help Iran better support its allies and proxies in advancing Iranian interests. It'll become more difficult as they work together. It'll become more difficult to isolate them politically and economically as they work together in this globalized economy. It could mean a more modernized Iranian IRGC and Iranian conventional military. And this would mean that Iran would be more capable to defend itself from attack, such as defending its nuclear program, and perhaps encourage more international adventures in places like Syria, Yemen, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. So none of this is good news. With that, we're going to open it up to questions. We can take them from the audience. We also can take them online. I think I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to pose a question to Andrea and Jim first, if that's all right, and then we'll move on to audience questions. Like I said, either here in the Clough Center or online. So, Andrea, why is Iran delaying? What is preventing them from moving forward? What is their strategic intent with their nuclear program? I mean, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's usually a duck. But and despite their denials, I mean, what's preventing them from just moving forward like North Korea did and actually testing a nuclear weapon? Is it technical? Is it a negotiating strategy? What do you think they're doing?
Well, I can speculate. I think it's mostly a political decision, but they still may have technical hurdles. With North Korea, certainly strategic neglect in our policy led them to go ahead. And so we don't want Iran to have that same mentality. And we don't also want to think that it's a foregone conclusion that they will go forward and that there's really nothing we can do about it. I think one of the things that's missing in deterring them from going forward is a credible U.S. military threat. We know that the regime pays attention. So the Juniper Oak exercises between the U.S. and Israel going on right now in the Mediterranean are critical to showcase the type of bombing campaign that we could conduct if needed be against an Iranian breakout. We need to also talk about a willingness to use force. We don't want to look to the example of the U.S. invading Iraq as an illustrious foreign policy achievement, but it did have an interesting side effect of dissuading the Iranian regime from pursuing its original goal of building 5 nuclear weapons by 2003. So they shelved the program to actually build the weapons. They didn't abandon the work altogether, as far as we can tell from the Mossad seized documents from Tehran on Iran's nuclear weapons program. And I'm not sure that the Iranians believe that we would use a military option if they chose to break out. I'm not sure they believe that President Biden wants to be entangled in another conflict in the Middle East. But if he does want to make this clear, he needs to continue exercises like the ones going on. They're all domain. They involve land, air, sea, space capabilities. They showcase what kind of effort we would be prepared to carry out. And I think from what I understand, it's a qualitative improvement in the scale and the scope of this exercise over past exercises. They're using lots of different fighters and bombers, live munitions. They're showing how they can suppress air defenses. cyber efforts, lots of different efforts to signal preparedness. So I think also if we keep the door open to sanctions relief and the expiring nuclear accord, if we don't resume some sort of maximum pressure effort, then Iran's calculus could shift to one like North Korea, that they can just go ahead and go forward and they won't be stopped, so why bother waiting?
Do you have any questions about their strategic intent of becoming a nuclear weapon state?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Okay. Yes. Do you have any question in your mind that their intent is to become a nuclear weapon state?
I don't think they've made the decision, and I think we still have lots of time, well, not lots, but months, maybe years, to deter them from making that kind of decision. So the trick is to get from a nuclear weapons program to actually making the nuclear weapons. And that's a big jump. They have to stand the chance that they'll be bombed. They have to believe that that's a credible threat. So we do have to deter them from going forward. And the whole point of making a credible military threat is so you don't have to use it. So we don't want to think that they for sure will go forward. We want to make the cost too high for them to do so.
Jim, what is Iran's relationship with Al-Qaeda? I mean, the talk after Zawahiri was killed, there's talk that the Saif al-Adel, who's been in Iran forever, I think, might become the new leader of Al-Qaeda. They said he's under house arrest and things along these lines, but he's been clearly there. I mean, what is their relationship with Al-Qaeda, and what is their relationship with the Taliban these days?
Well, I would say
when we talk about their concerns about Sunni extremism, right?
Right. Yeah, there's no love lost between Iran and the Taliban. They almost went to war. I think it was the late 1990s when the Taliban massacred, I believe it was 11 Iranian Revolutionary Guards that were diplomats on the side. You have the Sunni, Shia, different religious differences. You compounded by the ideological differences, and I think those differences are even more complex and convoluted when you talk about Iran's relationship with Al-Qaeda. I think they're frenemies in the sense that they have in the past cooperated against common enemies. If you look at the 9/11 Commission report, it recommended that a further report be compiled on the nature of these contacts, because there were so many of them in the 1990s when Iran and many Sunni radical extremist groups came together in Sudan, which was essentially the new Lebanon. And it's believed that the Sudanese leader kind of chaperoned the meeting between the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Al-Qaeda. At that point, Al-Qaeda had a few bombs, but they were nowhere near as big as the bomb that destroyed the Marine barracks, which is one of the largest bombs exploded since World War II. And Iran offered to train Al-Qaeda in Hezbollah camps in Lebanon and elsewhere. Al-Qaeda may have been involved in the Hezbollah bombing of the Khobar Towers barracks in Saudi Arabia that killed 19.
What do you think the relationship is today?
It's very awkward today because they're also struggling against each other for power in places like Syria. We have the Iranians propping up Assad and Al-Qaeda and other Sunni radicals trying to bring Assad down. So, both groups, Al-Qaeda and Iran, claimed to be bringing heaven to earth with new Islamist global revolutions, but really all they've done is create hell on earth, especially for the Iranian people.
I'm often reminded of the Persian proverb, use another's hand to catch the snake, right? In terms of these groups, especially in their relationship with Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Do we have an online question? Why don't we go there first? Nicole, could you read that out to us?
Can everyone hear me, or is the microphone
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about the cyber threat, and I have an audience question. Is there cyber warfare threat from Iran, and does Iran pose a threat in other dimensions of asymmetric warfare?
Yeah, I would say Iran definitely poses a growing cyber threat. Iran has stood up a cyber army that has launched many attacks against not only the U.S. but against Israel. An attack wiped out the Saudi Aramco's computer system and also a computer system in Qatar that dealt with natural gas. Iranian hackers have penetrated the computer network around a dam in New York and tried to infiltrate the system in Boston Children's Hospital, which the FBI director made a note of when he spoke in Boston. I think it was 2 years ago, or maybe last year. So they are out there, and I think that is a growing threat.
If we have any questions in the audience, if you raise your hand, we'll bring you a microphone. If not, we'll go back to. We have another online question. Yeah, many. Okay. Well, actually, let me try one here. We'll go back. I wanted to ask Andrea, where is Iran on warhead development, on really fashioning, weaponizing all this work they've done in the nuclear field? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think they've made quite a bit of progress since 2003. They've been able to launch into space, so they're developing ICBM type technology. And we don't know how well they're able to integrate a warhead into the missile. That would all be highly secret. So far, our intelligence agencies haven't detected progress, or they haven't been able to find it. So unfortunately, we just don't know a lot about the missile integration effort. But I think we can speculate that they would be able to get there within a year or two from having a workable nuclear device. That's still the estimate of governments right now.
Thank you. Nicole?
I have another question for Dr. Brooks. How much and what types of assistance do you think the United States, will provide the Israelis if they decide to move on the various locations of the central region?
Well, that's a big question. Obviously, the United States has a tremendous interest in what happens with the Iranian nuclear program. It's obviously a great threat to Israel. There's concerns about cascading proliferation in the region. If Iran became a nuclear weapon state, what would other states do? It's not quite clear, but I think there are a number that might be interested in developing their own nuclear weapons, which would include Saudi Arabia, perhaps even Turkey. But obviously, the United States would, depending on the situation. So I hate to answer hypotheticals, but I think we share the trajectory of the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, I maybe differ. I think Andrea's answered very well, but I think I believe that Iran is on the path to become a nuclear weapon state. The question is, can we prevent them from doing it? And I'm not quite clear as to why they haven't actually moved forward. But in that situation, it would depending on the situation. But I think the United States, if it came to the point where we needed to use military action, that we obviously may have to take that step. Is that something telling me something, or is that somebody trying to call in here? Jim, can you say a little bit about the relationship with the Taliban? I mean, what's Iran doing in Afghanistan?
Well, there's no love lost between Shia Iran and Sunni Taliban. Both of them are supremacists in the sense that they look down on and discriminate against the non-sectarian minorities that they rule over. Particularly Taliban historically has had a very hostile relationship to Shia Hazara ethnic minority in central Afghanistan, and the Islamic State even more so. And this Islamic State province that is based in Afghanistan, Pakistan, claims India, has attacked not only Taliban forces, but just ruthlessly attacked Shia civilians. And I think that's part of the problem of Islamist extremist groups that claim a direct pipeline to God, and therefore they think that they can ruthlessly use any means to advance that end. When they come up against each other, I think the warfare and the crimes against civilians are even more horrific.
Andrew, what do you think that the Russians will help the Iranians with their nuclear or missile program, especially their long range?
Yeah, that's an important question. We were talking about that. I think it's not off the table. We know that former Soviet nuclear weapons experts assisted Iran's nuclear weaponization effort years ago. It's unclear whether that help was sanctioned or blessed by the Russian state, if they knew about it or looked the other way. Russia has historically not seen an Iranian nuclear weapon as in its strategic interest, but things may have changed now that it's in a proxy war again with the West. Moscow might think that assisting Iran is a fair trade for arms and missiles, drones. And if Tehran needs help on weaponization or missile delivery, Russia may view little downside of doing so. It's already under such extreme penalties. And Moscow may think that it would focus the West's attention elsewhere if Iran were to go for nuclear weapons, detract from the war effort in Ukraine. So we really want our intelligence folks and those of our partners and allies to be on top of this, to be looking for anything, any kind of cooperation or assistance, people going to Iran to assist. And we would want to try to disrupt that using any covert means that we can. You know, if they're successful, we probably won't know about it. But all in all, that would be a win.
What do you think? I touched upon this. What do you think the Middle East would look like in 5 to 10 years if Iran actually possibly got the direction?
Well, I think we don't have to think too imaginatively anymore about what Iran would be like if it had the freedom to operate with a nuclear deterrent. So we see how the West has been reticent to arm Ukraine with the wrong weapons that will provoke Putin into using nuclear weapons or lead to nuclear escalation or even make him lose the war too decisively. We've been overly risk averse throughout that because of the risk of escalation. So I don't see any reason why Iran would not operate the same way, under the same mentality. If it has a nuclear deterrent, it may be more likely to invade territories of its neighbors or use proxies to cause more trouble. And then threaten nuclear use if anyone tries to get involved or push back. So, you know, what happens if Iranian proxies start hostilities with Israel or another one of our partners? Are we going to not get involved because we will fear becoming involved in a nuclear escalation? And as you mentioned, I think we would see the Saudis, the Turks, perhaps the Emiratis and the Egyptians moving forward with acquiring uranium enrichment, advanced nuclear capabilities. And then we have a very unstable region, even more so, and plenty of potential for miscalculation.
Do we have another online question?
Yeah, so the last question is, do you expect a major crisis with Iran this year? What would that look like as well?
I'll ask both of our panelists, what do you think? Major crisis this year from Iran? Why don't you start first, Jim, and then we'll go to him.
Okay, yeah, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a major crisis this year. I kind of expected one last year, but I think Iran slowed its incremental violations of the JCPOA in order to tamp down that. But I think it's just a matter of time this year. Because the margin of error is getting much more narrow. And if Iran continues on this collision course, then I would expect that Israel would take action. And, you know, I think that's one reason in our paper we recommended trying to upgrade Israeli deterrence against an Iranian nuclear breakout by providing bunker buster bombs and precision-guided munitions and aerial refueling tankers, because although Iran may doubt that the Biden administration would attack its illicit nuclear program, I don't think it'll doubt that Israel would do that. So that could increase deterrence, and I think the way to go is increase deterrence of a breakout, not reward Iran with sanctions relief for perhaps only temporarily delaying a breakout.
Andrew, do you think we're going to have a crisis this year, especially over the nuclear issue? What's your first
I'll give it 50-50 odds. I think something we should pay attention to is the uranium clock. So they have enough for 6 weapons at the moment. They're going to break out. They may want to have more. They may want to have at least enough for 10 weapons, maybe more. So if they're going to run the risk that their program gets bombed, they want to probably have enough stockpiled for a small nuclear arsenal. So I'll be a little more optimistic and hope that we have some time still to deter and delay their program.
Well, we've run out of time. Thanks so much to Andrea and Jim, and for a very rich discussion today. You've given us a lot to think about. I wish I could find some good news in all that we've talked about today. Also, thanks to the audience for joining us here in the Club Center at Heritage and online. And with that, today's event is concluded. Thank you.